The hostess didn't even look up when he walked in. Dusty sneakers, worn-out jeans, and a quiet confidence that didn't match his appearance.
Deliveries go through the back,
She said sharply, already turning away. But what she didn't know was that the man she just dismissed wasn't a delivery guy. He owned the entire restaurant. Before we dive into the story, comment below where in the world you're watching from. And at the end, don't forget to rate this story from 0 to 10. Your opinion helps us bring more stories like this to life. Now, enjoy the story.
It was just after 1 p.m. when the man walked into Le Vallon, one of the most exclusive restaurants on the Upper West Side. The place reeked of class. White linen tablecloths, soft jazz drifting through the air, and waiters who walked like they were gliding. And then there was him. Dusty sneakers, worn jeans, a faded green t-shirt that clung to his skin after a long walk in the sun. His hair was uncombed, the kind that hadn't seen a barber in weeks, and a travel-worn backpack rested casually on one shoulder. At the front, Candace, the maitre d' with the sharp jawline and sharper attitude, spotted him instantly. She didn't hide the way her eyes narrowed, scanning him like a barcode that didn't belong in their system. "Excuse me," she said, stepping forward and planting herself between him and the host's stand. "Deliveries are made through the back entrance." He blinked slowly, lips curling slightly at the edge. "I'm not here to deliver anything." "Oh," she folded her arms, already annoyed. "Then how can I help you?" "I'm here for lunch." There was a pause, a dangerous, weighted pause, and then came the smirk. Candace glanced around quickly, making sure no regulars were watching this unfold. "I'm sorry, sir, but we're fully booked for the afternoon," even though 3 empty tables were visible behind her. "That's okay," he replied, still polite. "I made a reservation." Candace's smile thinned. "And the name?" "Thomas." "Thomas?" she repeated, tapping the iPad without enthusiasm. "Just Thomas," he said with a smile. She let out a short, clipped laugh and pretended to check the list. Of course, there was no Thomas on it. But instead of saying so, she stepped to the side, made a show of scanning the seating chart, and returned with a practiced look of regret. "I'm sorry, sir. I don't see your reservation. Perhaps you booked the wrong location." He nodded slowly, as if that answer made perfect sense. "Maybe I did," he said, already turning away. "Thanks anyway." But just as he stepped back toward the door, something strange happened. Chef Marcel, the French-born head chef who only emerged from the kitchen for VIP guests, happened to pass by and froze when he saw the man. "Thomas?" Marcel said, astonished. "Mon Dieu, I didn't know you were arriving today." Candace turned, confused. "You know him?" Chef Marcel laughed, pulling off his hat and stepping forward. "This man," he said with a hand on Thomas's shoulder, "owns Le Vallon. He's the reason I left Paris." Candace's world tilted. And just like that, the man she had tried to push out the door had taken his place at the corner table, the one reserved for royalty, heads of state, and billionaires. But this story was far from over.
Candace stood frozen for a full 3 seconds, just long enough for her carefully crafted professional persona to crack. Her jaw didn't drop, but her eyes widened ever so slightly, and the color drained from her face like wine from a shattered glass. He owns the restaurant? Chef Marcel was already calling for staff to bring out Thomas's favorite wine, a vintage Bordeaux not even listed on the menu. Waiters rushed into motion, and the quiet rhythm of the restaurant shifted, like a tide turning. Candace quickly stepped aside, trying to melt into the wall as Thomas was escorted to the best table in the house. He didn't look at her, not once, but he didn't need to. The silence between them spoke louder than any words could have. The kind of silence that says, "You had your chance." A busboy passed by, whispering under his breath, "What just happened?" Another waiter replied, "That's the owner. I've only seen him twice. He keeps a low profile." Back at the table, Thomas removed his backpack, placing it carefully on the empty chair beside him. A server approached nervously with a chilled bottle, hands shaking slightly. "Mr. Thomas, we didn't know—" "It's okay," he interrupted gently. "I didn't tell anyone I was coming." "No worries at all, sir," the young waiter replied, fumbling slightly as he poured the wine. "It's an honor to have you here." Thomas gave him a nod of gratitude, calm, composed, and completely at ease. He was used to this. He had spent a lifetime being underestimated. And as he took his first sip of wine, Candace retreated toward the host stand, fingers trembling slightly as she adjusted a blazer. Behind her, whispers had already started to spread among the staff. One of the newer servers leaned toward the bartender. "I thought he was just some delivery guy." The bartender chuckled under his breath. "That's the thing about power. Real power doesn't need to shout. It just watches." Meanwhile, in the kitchen, Chef Marcel was grinning like a child. He instructed the sous chefs to prepare Thomas's favorite dish, black truffle risotto with saffron, aged parmesan, and a seared duck breast so tender it fell apart under the fork. As the scent filled the restaurant, the mood changed. Guests began to take notice. Some turned discreetly toward Thomas's table, recognizing his face from magazine profiles or business blogs. A few whispered his name. But Thomas, he just sat there, phone untouched, eyes observing, taking in everything, especially the way Candace now avoided looking his way at all. He remembered her tone when she told him to use the back entrance, her practiced condescension, the smirk when she didn't find his name on the reservation list. He didn't hate her. He wasn't even angry, but he wasn't going to protect her from what came next either, because this visit wasn't just for lunch. It was a test, and she had already failed.
Candace disappeared into the back office as soon as she could. Her hands trembled as she closed the door and leaned against it, heart pounding. Her mind raced through every interaction she'd had with Thomas in the past 5 minutes, replaying it like a horror movie on loop. She had made a huge mistake. And worse, she'd made it in front of the entire staff. She grabbed her phone and typed Thomas Llewellyn owner into Google, just to be sure. The first result was a Forbes profile. Thomas Calder, the silent architect behind one of New York's most exclusive restaurant empires. Below it was a photo of him in a tailored suit, smiling next to Michelin-starred chefs and celebrities. Candace dropped her phone onto the desk. Outside the office, the atmosphere in the dining room had shifted. It wasn't loud or obvious, but there was a tension in the air, a new kind of reverence, as if the walls themselves had realized who was sitting in their presence. At table 7, a couple who had once complained about a wine pairing now smiled too wide and laughed too hard. At table 3, a banker who often demanded VIP treatment sat silently, stealing glances at Thomas every few seconds. Candace straightened her blazer and took a deep breath. She couldn't undo what had happened, but she could try to contain it. Damage control, professionalism, control the narrative. She stepped out only to see Richard, the general manager, already walking toward Thomas's table with a practiced smile. Candace froze. She watched as Richard leaned down respectfully, offering a handshake. Thomas stood, something he rarely did, and returned it warmly. They exchanged a few words, smiles, and then a moment of stillness. Thomas gestured subtly toward Candace. Richard's smile stiffened. He nodded once, then turned toward her. Oh no. Richard approached slowly, like a wave of consequence crashing in slow motion. Candace, join me in the office, now. She obeyed without a word, cheeks burning. Every eye in the restaurant seemed to follow her walk of shame. Inside the office, Richard closed the door gently. His smile was gone. You do realize who that is? He asked. Candace nodded, eyes on the floor. He wanted to eat lunch, that's all. And you sent him to the back entrance. I thought he was... I know what you thought, Richard interrupted. But you didn't ask. You didn't check. You judged, fast, loudly, in front of customers. I didn't know, she said weakly. That's the point. You didn't know and you acted like you did. That's a liability, one we can't afford. Outside, a server quietly placed Thomas's risotto in front of him, and the man gave a small nod of thanks. He didn't touch the food yet. He was waiting. Not for the food, but for what would happen next. Back in the office, Candace's hands tightened into fists at her sides. Am I being fired? She asked, voice trembling. Richard didn't answer immediately. Go back to the host stand. Finish your shift. I'll speak to Mr. Calder after lunch. Candace's throat tightened. Yes, sir. As she stepped back into the dining room, eyes downcast, she felt the weight of every stare in the room, but none heavier than the one she couldn't see. Thomas hadn't looked at her once, because now he didn't need to.
Thomas let the silence settle like fine dust. He still hadn't touched his food. Instead, he watched, not with bitterness, not with revenge in his eyes, but with a level of patience that made people uneasy. Because true power doesn't need to speak to be heard. It just waits. Across the dining room, servers moved carefully, as if every step mattered more now. The sommelier adjusted his tie twice before approaching. Guests whispered, trying not to look too obvious, but the air had shifted. Everyone knew. Thomas Calder, the low-profile billionaire who owned La Vilaine and several other upscale restaurants across the country, was sitting alone, calm, smiling, and very aware of every detail. He finally picked up his fork. The risotto was perfect. Chef Marcel never missed. Each bite was a balance of texture, temperature, and memory. And yet, Thomas tasted something else layered beneath the saffron and truffle. Humility. Not from the dish, from the moment itself. He didn't usually show up unannounced. That wasn't his style. But today wasn't just about a meal. It was about reminding himself. It had been almost a decade since Thomas last walked into one of his own restaurants looking like, well, this. No suits, no drivers, no carefully curated image. Just Thomas. The man beneath the name. The man who once washed dishes in a cramped diner and ate leftovers after close. He hadn't planned to test anyone today, but Candace had made a choice, a very loud, very public choice, and now the whole team had to respond. Richard, the manager, returned to the floor. His smile was thin, but functional. He approached the table. Mr. Calder, I hope everything is to your satisfaction? Thomas looked up, eyes calm. Almost everything, but we'll get there. Richard nodded, understanding the weight behind the words. Would you, like to speak to anyone in particular? Thomas paused, then shook his head. No need. I'm just here to enjoy lunch. The team's doing a great job. Relief crossed Richard's face, but only for a second. Of course, he said. We're honored to have you with us. Thomas nodded once and then turned his gaze back to the dining room. He saw Candace near the host stand, pretending to organize the reservation tablet, her hands shaking slightly. A couple approached to be seated, and she forced a smile, voice trembling as she greeted them. She was unraveling, fast. And still, Thomas said nothing. But deep inside, he was deciding. He remembered his own first job, how a manager once embarrassed him in front of an entire kitchen staff over a broken plate. How that moment made him promise never to humiliate someone the same way, no matter what they did. But humiliation wasn't the only way to teach. Sometimes, silence is louder. He returned to his food and let her sweat, because what came next wouldn't be a punishment. It would be a lesson. Candace felt like she was walking through fog. Every sound was muffled. The clinking of glasses, the gentle hum of jazz, the conversations at nearby tables. It all blurred together. Her heartbeat, however, was loud. Too loud. She tried to stay busy, arranging menus, confirming future reservations, smiling just enough to seem composed. But every time she looked up, she could feel it. Eyes on her. She wasn't sure if the staff was judging her, or just relieved they weren't the ones who messed up. And worst of all, Thomas hadn't so much as glanced in her direction since taking his seat. It was that silence again, that unbearable, suffocating silence. She had no idea how long she could take it. Meanwhile, in the kitchen, Chef Marcel whispered to one of the sous chefs, "He hasn't even touched the duck, and I made it just the way he likes." "Should I remake it?" the sous chef asked. "No," Marcel replied. "He's not waiting on the food." Back on the floor, Thomas was finally nearing the end of his meal. He wasn't rushing. Every movement was deliberate. He sipped his wine, wiped his mouth with a cloth napkin, and then leaned back, folding his hands in his lap. The moment had come. Richard reappeared again, hovering nearby, clearly waiting for permission to approach. Thomas gave a slight nod. "I hope the meal was satisfactory, Mr. Calder." It was, as always. Marcel outdid himself. "We'll let him know," Richard said, smiling, then hesitated. "Is there anything else we can assist you with today?" Thomas tilted his head, as if considering the question. Then he said, "I'd like to speak to your staff, briefly." Richard blinked. "All of them?" Thomas nodded. "Yes, everyone on shift, dining room and kitchen. 5 minutes will do." Richard didn't ask why. Within minutes, the dining room was reset, and the servers gathered near the bar. Cooks still in aprons, servers lined up nervously, and Candace lingering in the back, half hidden behind a waiter. Thomas stood up slowly and walked toward them, every step quiet but commanding. "I won't take long," he began, voice steady. "I know you're all busy, but I wanted to say something while it's fresh." The room was silent. "I came in today without warning, without suits or appointments, and I was reminded of something I've always believed." He looked around at their faces, some anxious, some curious, some ashamed. That character is revealed not when people expect to be seen, but when they believe no one's watching. Several eyes shifted nervously. Thomas continued, "This restaurant was built on excellence, not just in food, but in how we treat people. All people, whether they walk in with a reservation or a backpack." He let that linger. In this business, it's easy to assume, easy to judge, but it's just as easy to ask, to listen, to lead with grace. His gaze paused briefly on Candace, but he still didn't call her out. "I don't need perfection," he said. "I need intention. And I saw a lot of that today. People adjusting, helping, stepping up. That means something to me." Then he smiled. "And for what it's worth, the risotto was perfect." The staff chuckled quietly, tension breaking like glass underfoot. "Thank you," Thomas said, stepping back. "That's all." The team clapped, unsure if it was appropriate, but unable not to. A few even looked relieved. And Candace? She stood there stunned. He could have destroyed her, fired her, humiliated her in front of everyone. But instead, he gave a speech. And somehow that stung even more. Because now she wasn't just afraid of losing her job. She was ashamed of how she'd done it. Thomas returned to his table, now cleared except for the wine glass and a folded napkin. The restaurant began to move again. Guests returned their attention to their meals, waiters resumed their rhythm, and the staff drifted back to their posts, buzzing with quiet energy from what had just happened. Candace didn't move right away. She remained by the bar, shoulders stiff, fingers lightly touching the edge of the counter as if anchoring herself to something solid. She had just been handed something rare: grace. But grace comes with a weight, the weight of responsibility, of knowing you were wrong and being given the chance to do better instead of being cast aside. She watched Thomas from a distance. He was back to being unreadable, calm, composed, the kind of presence that made people sit straighter without realizing it. Richard approached her gently. He didn't ask for anything. He said quietly, "I know. No punishment, no formal complaint, not even your name mentioned. I know." But that doesn't mean he didn't see everything. Candace nodded slowly. Her mouth was dry. "Do I still have a job?" Richard didn't answer right away. He studied her for a moment. "That depends," he said finally. "Not on him, on you." She blinked. "What do you mean?" "He didn't humiliate you. He didn't fire you. That's not weakness. That's leadership. But you need to ask yourself if you're the kind of person who learns from this or repeats it when no one's watching." Candace's throat tightened. She wasn't used to feeling small. She was used to control, to first impressions, to managing the room. But none of that mattered now, because the room had seen something else. And more importantly, so had she. At that moment, she realized that Thomas wasn't just teaching a lesson to her. His message had landed across the team. It had exposed a flaw not just in her attitude, but in the entire culture they had allowed to grow. The obsession with appearances, the silent hierarchy of wealth, the way someone's clothes seemed more important than their voice. She had been part of the problem, and now she had a choice. Meanwhile, Thomas had finished the last of his wine. He checked the time, stood up, and headed toward the exit. Not rushed, not dramatic, just complete. As he passed the host stand, Candace instinctively stepped aside to let him through. But this time, she didn't look away. "Mr. Calder?" she said quietly. He stopped and turned toward her, expression neutral, and just wanted to say, "I'm sorry." Thomas studied her for a beat, not judging, just listening. And then he nodded. "Thank you." He didn't say more. He didn't need to. He pushed open the door, stepped into the bright afternoon sun, and was gone.
Candace exhaled for the first time in what felt like hours. And somehow, the air in Llewellyn felt different now. Not heavier, cleaner.
That evening, long after the last guests had left and the kitchen lights had dimmed, the staff gathered around the bar for their usual end-of-shift recap. But the mood was different. No one talked over each other. No one joked too loudly. They all knew they had witnessed something rare, something humbling. Even Marcel, the legendary chef who never left the kitchen unless the world was on fire or royalty was in the building, remained unusually quiet as he wiped down his knives. Candace sat at the edge of the group, not saying much. She hadn't taken off her blazer. Her hair, once immaculately styled, now hung slightly loose around her face. The pride she used to wear like armor had cracked, and what was left was something more human, more real. Richard finally cleared his throat. "So, today happened," he said, trying to lighten the mood. A few people chuckled awkwardly. "It was intense," someone murmured. "That man could have destroyed her," said another, eyes flicking toward Candace and quickly away again. "She knows," Richard replied gently. "We all know." There was a pause, and then Candace spoke, her voice calm but steady. "He gave me more dignity than I gave him." Everyone went quiet. I thought I was good at my job, and maybe I was. At least the part where you smile at the right people, get them seated fast, make them feel important. But today, I realized I've been performing, not welcoming. No one interrupted her. Even the bartender stopped polishing glasses. I don't deserve to keep this job because of a speech, but I want to earn the right to stay. For real. Richard nodded slowly. Then do it. Starting tomorrow. And just like that, the mood began to shift. A few people smiled. Marcel gave a single approving grunt, which, from him, might as well have been a standing ovation. The team dispersed soon after, but something lingered. An awareness. A new culture quietly beginning to form, not because of a meeting or a policy, but because of a man who had shown them what leadership without ego looked like. Meanwhile, across town, Thomas entered a modest apartment. Nothing flashy. Hardwood floors, stacks of books, a few framed photos of his parents, and a younger version of himself washing dishes in a tiny diner kitchen. He placed his backpack on the table and sat down with a quiet sigh. He hadn't expected today to become what it was, but in a strange way, it reminded him why he'd started all this in the first place, why he kept things simple, why he didn't wear his wealth like a badge. Because people show you who they are when they think you're no one. And that's when the truth matters most. He took out a small notebook and jotted something down. Power isn't in being seen, it's in seeing. He closed the book, and for the first time in a long time, he felt proud.
The next morning, the energy inside La Valonne was noticeably different. Candace arrived early, earlier than usual, dressed sharply but without the air of superiority she used to carry. This time, she greeted the cleaning staff by name. She brought coffees for the kitchen crew. She even held the door open for a delivery guy who looked surprised, almost suspicious. And when she reached the host stand, she didn't just check the reservation list. She looked around the room, taking in the space like it was new. Because it was. She was. Richard noticed the change immediately. He didn't say anything, just offered a small nod, the kind that said, "I see the difference." By noon, the restaurant was in full swing. The usual crowd filed in, lawyers, executives, socialites, but something about the rhythm felt smoother. Staff moved like a team instead of individuals. Smiles felt genuine, not rehearsed. Candace handled the late arrival with grace, offered a waiting guest a complimentary drink without being asked, and even helped bus a table when one of the runners slipped behind. She was leading, not with authority, but with presence. And just after 2 p.m., when a young man walked in wearing an oversized hoodie and scuffed sneakers, she didn't blink. "Hi there," she said warmly. "Welcome to La Valonne. Do you have a reservation, or are you hoping for a walk-in?" The guy looked up, clearly caught off guard. Walk in if that's okay." She smiled. "Of course, just give me one moment." No judgment, no assumption, just service. The man was seated without issue. In the kitchen, Chef Marcel peeked into the dining room and smirked. "She's learning," he muttered, chopping chives. By the end of the day, it was clear to everyone the incident with Thomas had shaken the foundation, but it hadn't broken the team. It had revealed the cracks. And now they were filling them. Meanwhile, across town, Thomas sat in a quiet meeting room inside a nondescript office building. No marble floors, no glass walls, just a whiteboard, a pot of coffee, and a handful of people who looked more like teachers than executives. "I want to talk about expansion, but not just locations, philosophy." The room leaned in. "We've built restaurants, good ones, but I want to build something that lasts longer than food." He tapped the whiteboard. Hospitality, not just to the rich, to everyone. There were murmurs of agreement. No more velvet ropes for the sake of velvet ropes. No more assuming based on shoes or suits. We don't need gatekeepers. We need bridges. One of the women at the table, an older manager from a restaurant in Chicago, raised her hand. "So, a new standard?" Thomas nodded. "A human one." He wasn't looking for perfect staff or perfect service. He was looking for people who saw the person standing in front of them, not the shoes, the clothes, the watch, the wallet. And as he looked out the window at the crowded street below, he felt something he hadn't felt in years. Hope. 1 week later, Thomas returned to Le Vaillant. This time, he came through the front door again, not to test anyone, not to catch them off guard, but simply to see, to observe whether the lesson he left behind had taken root. He wore the same worn jeans, the same beat-up sneakers, and the same quiet expression. But the moment he stepped in, the difference was undeniable. Candace spotted him immediately. She didn't flinch. She didn't retreat. She stepped forward, chin raised, and offered a warm, genuine smile. "Welcome back, Mr. Calder," she said softly. "We're honored to have you." Thomas smiled back, not with superiority, not with sarcasm, but with quiet approval. "Good to be here." "This way," she said, gesturing toward the very same corner table. He followed her, and as he passed the dining room, he noticed something had changed, not just the staff, the atmosphere. There was more laughter now, less stiffness. Servers chatted politely with guests without looking over their shoulders. A young hostess helped an elderly couple to their seats with care that went beyond duty. And across the room, a waiter high-fived a busboy as they reset a table, not obnoxiously, but with the joy of belonging. The culture had shifted, and Candace, she had clearly done the work. As he sat, she placed the menu before him. "Would you like the usual, or shall we surprise you today?" Thomas grinned. "Surprise me." She nodded and left with ease. In the kitchen, Marcel didn't need instructions. He'd been preparing something special since he heard Thomas was on the books today. While waiting, Thomas pulled out a small leather notebook, the same one he always carried. He flipped through old notes, reminders of what mattered. One line stood out. Power should never be about proving. It should be about improving. He wrote a new one beneath it. Sometimes the softest correction leaves the deepest mark. Candace returned with a glass of wine. Not the Bordeaux this time, but a more humble vintage with a bold aroma. "This pairs better with what's coming," she said confidently. He raised the glass and sipped. It was perfect. "You've done well," he said simply. Candace smiled, a little stunned by the praise. "Thank you. That means a lot." He nodded. "The restaurant feels lighter." She looked around, as if seeing it through his eyes. "We're trying, every day." Thomas leaned back, satisfied. "That's all I ever wanted." She paused, then added, "And I'll never forget that day." "I hope you don't," he said gently, "but not because of what you did wrong, but because of what came after." Candace's eyes glistened slightly, but she didn't look away. This wasn't redemption by apology. It was redemption by transformation. And everyone in Le Vaillant had felt it. Thomas knew then that this location, once just one of many, was now his blueprint, his reminder, his favorite, because it had been cracked and rebuilt with intention.
News of Thomas Calder's quiet visit and the quiet revolution it sparked didn't stay within the walls of Le Vaillant for long. News spread through the hospitality world, not through press releases or Instagram posts, but through whispers. Managers told their teams about the owner who showed up dressed like nobody. Chefs told kitchen crews about the CEO who sat alone and said everything without raising his voice. And most importantly, employees listened. At Le Vaillant, things weren't just better. They were different. Staff turnover dropped, guest satisfaction scores rose, but those were just numbers. The real shift was deeper. Now, during pre-shift meetings, Candace didn't just review the reservation list. She shared stories of guests, their habits, their preferences, their names. New hires were trained not just on procedure, but on presence, eye contact, kindness, curiosity. And the phrase that had once been whispered in annoyance, "just another walk-in," had vanished entirely.
because they all knew now. You never really know who's walking in. A month later, Thomas sat in a boardroom with his executive team. The slide deck was open on the screen, Q3 expansion strategy. But instead of opening with numbers, he stood and said, "I want to start with a story." He told them everything. Not the glamorous version, not the PR-friendly kind, the real story, about the mistake, about the silence, about Candace, about what happens when people are seen or not seen. When he finished, no one said a word for several seconds. Then someone from operations asked, "Do you want to build more restaurants like Le Villon?" Thomas shook his head. "I want to build more cultures like Le Villon." The CFO asked, "How do we scale that?" Thomas smiled. "By starting small, one person, one shift, one moment at a time." Meanwhile, back at Le Villon, a small moment was unfolding. A single mother entered with her young son, both dressed modestly. She looked nervous, eyes darting to the chandelier, the linen napkins, the suited guests. Her hands clutched her purse a little too tightly. But before she could feel out of place, Candace appeared beside her with a smile so sincere it disarmed every insecurity in the room. "Welcome," she said gently. "We're honored to have you." She crouched to address Du Bois directly. "And what's your name, young man?" He lit up instantly. The mother relaxed. They were seated at a quiet corner booth, the same one Thomas had occupied during that unforgettable afternoon. And as they settled in, something unspoken passed through the air. This place was built for everyone, not just for millionaires, not just for those who looked the part, but for those with stories, for those who deserved to be seen.
Later that week, as the city buzzed through another Friday evening, Le Villon glowed like a jewel in the heart of Manhattan, not just for its cuisine or its clientele, but for something far rarer in a luxury restaurant: warmth. Thomas Calder returned once more, but this time not as a silent observer and not dressed down. He wore a charcoal gray blazer, no tie, and that same quiet demeanor. No flash, just clarity. As he stepped inside, the staff straightened with pride, not fear. They greeted him like family, not because he demanded it, but because he had earned it. Candace was waiting at the host stand. Not tense, not performative, just ready. "Mr. Calder," she smiled, "your table is waiting." "No," he said, "not today." She tilted her head, curious. "I'm here for something else." Thomas glanced behind him, where two young people entered, nervous, unsure of their surroundings. A brother and sister, dressed modestly, their eyes wide with quiet awe. Candace looked to Thomas for an explanation. "They're scholarship recipients," he said, "first in their family to go to college. Tonight is their celebration, and this dinner is on me." Candace beamed. She approached the two guests and guided them in with kindness so gentle it could never be trained, only learned. Thomas didn't sit. He stayed near the entrance for a moment, watching the staff move, watching the atmosphere breathe, watching how the team now treated every single person like the most important guest in the room. And then he turned to leave. But before he reached the door, Richard caught up to him. "You sure you don't want to stay?" Thomas looked back at the restaurant, his restaurant, a lie in a way that no five-star review could capture. "I already got what I came for." Richard smiled and nodded. As Thomas walked out into the New York night, he passed by the window. Inside, he could see the sister laughing, her shoulders finally relaxed. The brother holding the menu like it was made of gold. Candace pouring water like she was serving royalty. And maybe, in a way, she was. Because that was the real transformation. Not the staff, not the reputation, but the realization that dignity isn't a luxury. It's a right. and that the most powerful person in the room is not always the richest. Sometimes it's the one who chooses to see. That night, Le Volant didn't just serve food. It served a reminder. Everyone matters, even the ones we overlook, especially them.
If this story moved you, leave a comment with your rating from 0 to 10. And tell us what part hit you the hardest. Your support helps us bring more meaningful stories to life. Don't forget to subscribe for tomorrow's video. And remember, the smallest moments can change everything. Thank you for watching.